Now, there have been many heartbreaking scenes on Corey recently as Paul's motor neurone disease continues to take a turn for the worse.
I'm losing my speech. But we already knew that, so they did an oral motor exam, and my swallow's not great either.
They're concerned about him choking.
Okay. So, what does that mean?
It means I can't eat solid food anymore.
Daniel Brocklebank, who of course plays Paul's husband Billy, joins us now. Really tough scenes to watch, but I'm guessing incredibly heartbreaking and difficult to try and portray and to do the storyline justice as well. And it's one that's very personal to you, Daniel.
It is. It is. My grandfather had motor neurons disease, so my family have essentially lived through what Billy is now going through. Pete is doing an incredible job of representing somebody that's living with motor neurons disease. He's absolutely nailing it. So
and you've worked with the motor neuron disease for like 20 years.
Yeah.
And this story came about not because of that. It just sort of happened to be.
Yeah, yeah.
So it was extraordinary, the connection that you had with it anyway.
Yeah, the producers had no idea when they came to me and said, this is what we're going to be doing. No idea. So it is something that's very, very personal. But sometimes when you're doing a storyline that you have no connection to, you can research it, you know, to within an inch of its life. But there's always that niggling thing at the back of your head that you might not be getting it quite right. Whereas with this, because this is a personally lived experience, I know that we're doing it justice, and it's.
And Corey does that well. They sort of really get the sensitivity of a story, I think, and they talk to the right people surrounding it. They try to do everything justice, really, don't they?
Yeah,
they've
of course.
done this very much. I know they've worked closely with the MND Association.
Yeah, they have. I mean, it's always important with an issue-led storyline to make sure that we're, you know, hitting the right notes. So the team worked tirelessly to make sure that we're representing the MND community.
And also the family and those affected around the person that's suffering too. That's such an important part of this.
Yeah, of course. You know, it goes way beyond just the person with the illness.
Exactly. And poor Billy isn't handling it well, really. He's putting a very good face on, isn't he? But he's also struggling.
Yeah, of course. I think, and as anybody would, you know, he's watching the person that he loves slowly deteriorate in front of his eyes. So
it's a tough story, but one that has to be told, I think, and that's the important part of it, isn't it? Aside from Corey, though, Daniel, you've had a very unfortunate incident just last month with one of your beloved dogs.
Yes.
Ended up, sadly, in the vets, which, you know, none of us have to want to do with our animals, but it happens. But you've sort of gone on a bit of a crusade off the back of this experience. What happened?
Well, all three of my dogs are, they're all rescues from the Dogs Trust, so I have no idea what their lineage is. And one of them, Jean, who's the one there on the left with the turquoise harness, she's always had this little cough since she was a pup. She's been backwards and forwards from the vets. We've never got to the bottom of it. And then about a month ago, her breathing really deteriorated quite rapidly. So it was late on a Friday night. My vets were shut, so we had to take her to an emergency vet. She was checked in. And the vet's care was, I can't fault that at all. It was phenomenal. But what sort of made me question things was just the price of how much we were charged. I mean, it was £500 just to admit her. She was in care overnight, and we were called the next morning at about 10:30 to say that the bill was now another £1,500 on top of the £500 that we'd already paid. She'd had an oxygen tent. She'd been in an oxygen tent overnight, some antibiotics, paracetamol, some scans on her lungs. They wanted to keep her in for another 24 hours for observation. We were told that would be another £600 on top of the £2,000 bill that was already sitting there. So when I went to pick her up, I asked for an itemised bill. What really made me start to question this was one of the charges on the itemised bill was almost £27 for paracetamol. Now, obviously, I don't know much about how much it costs for an oxygen tent, for example, but I do know how much paracetamol costs. So I suddenly thought, well, that's a huge markup on a very cheap drug. So I sent the bill to the Dogs Trust, where my 3 came from, and asked them to get their vets to look over it to see if it was expensive. And they came back and said, no, that's about standard. And I said, well, why? Where's the justification in charging that much for paracetamol? And if there is that much of a markup on the paracetamol, is there that much of a markup on everything? Now, this is not an attack on vets or veterinary nurses at all. The care she had was incredible. But through research, I've discovered that over the last few decades, I mean, the veterinary industry used to be a cottage industry. It was run and owned by vets. But over the last few decades, around 60% of vets in the UK have been bought out by huge corporations, which basically means they have the monopoly on the market. And, you know, I'm in an incredibly fortunate position that I could afford to pay for that care. But if I couldn't, what would have happened to that little
and
dog?
sadly, a lot of people find themselves in that
Especially
position.
at the
You mentioned
moment.
the Dogs Trust. It's trusts like that, sadly, have to take animals in.
Well,
because
around
families can't-
13% of admissions to the Dogs Trust are because people cannot afford the veterinary care.
Well, it's like you say, it's certainly not an attack on the veterinary staff because,
No,
like,
no.
they're our first point of call, aren't they?
Yeah.
When you go into
And they
panic
do an
about your
amazing
animal.
job.
We did get in touch with the British Veterinary Association president, Dr. Anna Judson, who has said vets provide highly specialised, tailored medical care for the UK's animals. And whilst we understand prices can seem costly, like all businesses, vet practices need to charge appropriately to ensure they can remain financially viable, open and ready to treat animals coming through their doors with a whole range of medical issues. But basically, you think there should be some sort of cap, there should be some system
Something
that allows us
regulated
to have our...
Yeah, I mean, I get it. Look, vets it's an industry. They've got to make a profit. I do understand that, of course. But I would argue that it's not the vets themselves that are reaping the financial rewards of these costs. It's the corporations that have bought out the veterinary practices
Yes,
themselves.
there's something else sort of potentially going on, unless it's always a cost that you don't necessarily have that money sitting aside for your
of course
pet.
not.
You know, we're talking about cost of living now, where every penny counts.
Well, this,
so
I mean,
it's
this
very
goes
tough.
way beyond just the vets. I mean, look at the energy companies boasting of billions of pounds worth of profit when people can't even afford to heat their homes. You know, this isn't just this is across the board.
It's something like this. Well, you're definitely you're starting the conversation. That is for sure,
Good.
Daniel. It's one that needs to be had clearly, because it's always a shock getting that bill, isn't it?
was.
But it's your dog, it's your baby,
know,
so you
I
want to
know.
do everything that you can. Thank you so much, Daniel. And yes, we'll be watching Corrie, of course. And yeah, as heartbreaking as it is, we need to see it, don't we? We need
do.
to talk
We
about
do.
it. Thank you so much.
Thanks for having me
So
on.
good to see you this morning. Thank you.